Welcome to the Unraveling the Scriptures channel. The fate of the wives of the fallen angels, after receiving the heavenly knowledge illicitly revealed to them, remains shrouded in shadows and mystery. What we do know, through ancient apocryphal texts and traditions preserved in millennia-old accounts, is that these women became the first bearers of a hidden wisdom, a wisdom that was never meant to be shared with mankind. These celestial secrets, originally reserved for the divine realms, were imparted to them by rebellious angels, the so-called Watchers, in an act of cosmic disobedience. Upon receiving this forbidden knowledge, which included teachings on witchcraft, astrology, manipulation of the elements, and incantations, these women began to pass such knowledge to future generations. In doing so, they gave rise to entire bloodlines corrupted by the practice of magical arts and occult rituals. Thus, according to some esoteric traditions and pseudepigraphical texts, such as the Book of Enoch, these women did not merely partake in the corruption of the earth, they became active protagonists in the construction of a parallel civilization, a civilization where the sacred was exchanged for the profane, and divine mysteries were commercialized as earthly power. They were, therefore, the first witches in recorded history, mystical ancestors who, knowingly or not, initiated the legacy of sorcery that would persist across the centuries. Because of this, the punishment they received was unique and deeply symbolic. The Book of Enoch, an ancient and controversial work that offers an alternative and complementary perspective to the canonical biblical texts, claims that these human wives of the fallen angels underwent a supernatural transformation as a result of their profane alliance. According to the text, they became sirens, hybrid beings often depicted as aquatic entities, though their true origins are far more complex than popular myths suggest. However, this assertion raises an intriguing question. The mythology of the sirens, as known in the Western world, has deep roots in the culture of ancient Greece. The oldest known records describing sirens date back to approximately 300 BC, long after the events described in the antediluvian era. Moreover, the earliest mythological sirens were not marine creatures with fishtails and flowing hair. Quite the contrary. In classical Greek tradition, sirens were described as winged beings, half woman, half bird, who flew above the seas, seducing sailors with hypnotic and irresistible songs. Their voices enchanted seafarers, causing them to lose their way and crash upon the rocks. These sirens were messengers of doom, heralds of death and deception. If we draw a symbolic bridge between this image and the descriptions found in the Book of Enoch, we might assume that the wives of the fallen angels, if indeed transformed, did not become the deep-sea mermaids of later legend, but rather something far older and more enigmatic, enchanting and fatal birds. Here arises a fascinating theological and symbolic hypothesis. The wives of the Watchers were transformed not into mere mythological creatures, but into singing birds of the abyss, spiritual entities dwelling at the threshold between heaven and sea, between the divine and the fallen. The image evokes something both celestial and dark, a kind of divine irony in which those who receive the wisdom of heaven are cast into the depths, condemned to seduce and deceive until the end of time. To better understand this scenario, we return to the Holy Scriptures, specifically the book of Genesis, chapter 6. It is here that we find the most direct account of the interaction between the sons of God and the daughters of men. This text, revered for millennia, says the following: "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Genesis 6:1-2. Here, the term sons of God is often interpreted in some ancient Jewish and Christian traditions as a direct reference to the fallen angels, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, celestial beings who transgressed the boundaries established by God. The daughters of men, in turn, were human women living among the descendants of Adam, between the generation of Enoch and the generation of Noah. This unnatural, forbidden, and deeply symbolic union gave rise to a race of giants known as the Nephilim, colossal beings who, according to scripture, were the mighty men of old, men of renown. These hybrid beings, born from the union of corrupted celestial and vulnerable human, not only marked the beginning of an era of great violence and perversion, but also symbolized the complete corruption of God's original plan for humanity. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil, continually. Genesis 6:5. Spiritual degeneration had reached such an alarming point that the very Creator was deeply grieved by the course his creation had taken. This is one of the most moving passages in the Bible. God, in his omniscience, beholds the total deviation of humanity and declares his decision to destroy all that breathes. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. Genesis 6:7. The earth, as described by the sacred narrative, had become utterly corrupt, filled with violence, injustice, and innocent blood. And in the midst of this chaos, only one man found grace in the eyes of the Lord, Noah, the righteous, the blameless among his generation. Noah walked with God, and it was to him that the Lord entrusted the mission of preserving life through the coming judgment. Thus began a new phase in human history, marked by the covenant between God and Noah, yet the memory of past transgressions endured. The angels who descended, the women who were corrupted, the hybrid offspring who ravaged the earth, and the enchanting songs that led many to ruin. But ultimately, if the wives of the fallen angels were human women, how could they have transformed into the beings we now know as sirens, mythical figures that later came to be interpreted as the first witches on earth? The answer to this question lies at the intersection of religious tradition, ancient mythology, and the spiritual imagination of early civilizations, particularly during the transitional period between paganism and early Christianity. The connection between these women and the archetype of the siren should not be understood merely in literal or biological terms. The transformation described in ancient texts, such as the Book of Enoch, is as much symbolic as it is supernatural. It speaks of a change in essence, a spiritual metamorphosis. By entering into a profane covenant with the fallen angels, these women became something beyond human, something that dwelled between heaven and the abyss. The symbolic representation of this hybrid condition would later be solidified in mythology as the figure of the siren, seductive, enchanting, dangerous, and exiled. By the 4th century AD, as Christianity spread and became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, many pagan beliefs and myths began to be reinterpreted or suppressed. The Christian faith, when confronted with the vast universe of mythological imagery inherited from the Greek, Roman, and Eastern worlds, sought either to adapt or to confront them in light of Christian doctrine. It was within this context that the literal belief in sirens began to be gradually discouraged among Christians. In these pagan accounts, sirens were hybrid creatures with the heads of women and the bodies of birds. They lived on remote and perilous islands, surrounded by hidden rocks beneath the sea. Their main power was not physical strength, but vocal seduction. Through supernatural melodies, they could manipulate the minds and hearts of sailors, leading them willingly to death. The siren's song was more than a sound. It was a spell, an emotional and spiritual prison. This image, women with wings, bird claws, and enchanting voices, can be found in various works of early Greek art. Many 6th century BC ceramics depict sirens as birds with female faces, piercing eyes, long feathers, and scaly feet. Over time, these representations evolved. They began to appear as female figures with bird-like legs, some with wings, others holding or playing musical instruments such as harps, lyres, or flutes. In this context, music was not merely art, but magic, a spiritual gift tracing back to the celestial origins of the fallen angels and their human wives. Curiously, The 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, known as the Suda, offers an even more peculiar description. According to it, sirens were sparrows from the waist up and women from the waist down. In other versions, they appeared as small birds with feminine faces, a representation that merges the ethereal with the earthly, the light with the bodily, precisely like the women who took part in union with the Watchers, human in form, yet touched by a distorted celestial essence. Over time, sirens became increasingly humanized in artistic and literary representations. From hybrid creatures with wings and claws, they began to be portrayed as stunningly beautiful women with sculpted bodies, flowing hair, and hypnotic eyes. Not only their voices, but now also their bodies, came to be considered instruments of seduction. The transition from the winged siren to the aquatic siren with a fishtail was gradual and accompanied by the development of new cultural aesthetics, especially during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It is important to note that although there are siren-like figures in cultures around the world, such as the Nagas in India, the Kappas in Japan, or the Mami Waters in West Africa, the best known and most studied are, in fact, those from Greco-Roman tradition and Germanic legends. Within these traditions, the names and genealogies of the sirens were recorded, though often in contradictory versions. Some Greek sources claimed there were only 2 sirens, Adim and Telia. Others stated there were 3, Pino, Glate, and Telzipia, or in another tradition, Parano, Leah, and Leosia. There are also versions citing 5 and others listing up to 13 distinct names, including Philippia, Field, Felino, Ma, Agape, Agim, Pacino, Pino, Piso, Parano, Leah, Leosia, Rhydon, and Telis. This diversity of names reflects the vastness of the mythological imagination and the attempt to name the unnameable, the fragmented essence of the ancient wives of the Watchers, scattered through the centuries as echoes of an ancestral sin. The parentage of the sirens also varies depending on the source. In Greek, some myths claim that the father of these creatures was Phorcys, who also begot other infamous monsters such as the Gorgons, including the dreaded Medusa. Others name Achelous, the river god, symbol of fluidity and transformation. Their mothers, in turn, were said to be muses, such as Chick or Momin, nymphs like Stapi, or even the goddess Gaia herself, the living and conscious earth. Regardless of the genealogy, it is evident that the sirens were always of hybrid origin, born from the union of the divine and the natural, the wild and the spiritual, much like the Nephilim and their human mothers. It is possible, therefore, that the myths about mermaids are distorted or reinterpreted versions of the same archetypal story. The transgression of divine boundaries and the emergence of creatures that do not completely belong to either world. However, Germanic tradition presents a fascinating variation of this figure. The siren known as Lorelei, also spelled Lurey or Lurley. Unlike the Greek sirens, Lorelei was not always represented as a visible creature. In some versions, she was a woman betrayed by love, who, after her death, became a wandering spirit whose voice still echoes from the cliff that bears her name along the banks of the Rhine River. In others, she appears as a beautiful woman by the water's edge, combing her golden hair while singing songs that lead sailors to certain death. Much like the ancient wives of the fallen angels, Lorelei was a figure of supernatural beauty, but also of deep sorrow and longing. She symbolized the soul that loves intensely and, once betrayed, transforms that love into a curse. Some medieval Christian scholars interpreted her story as a metaphor for the seduction of sin, that which is pleasing to the eyes but deadly to the spirit. In Greek tradition, the domain of the sirens was an island known as Anissa or Anoa, names nearly lost to time, but which designated the place where danger was hidden beneath the promise of pleasure. For Lorelei, the setting was a steep cliff veiled in mist, where the river narrows and the current intensifies, a true spiritual battlefield between the call from above and the depths of deception. Sirens, in all these traditions, are described as beings of almost unbearable beauty. Their hair, often golden, could also take on rare colors among humans: silver brown, fiery red, obsidian black, or even bluish and greenish hues associated with the world of spirits. Their physical appearance was shaped not by the laws of flesh, but by the mysteries of spirit. This echoes the ancient conception that these women were heirs of a lineage that had transgressed the boundaries set by God. Women transformed both inside and out, cursed with the gift of seduction and burdened with the weight of perdition. Descriptions of sirens over the centuries did not follow a single standardized form. On the contrary, they vary widely in both appearance and symbolism, reflecting the many cultural, spiritual, and religious contexts in which they were embedded. Some are portrayed as slender figures with ethereal beauty and fragile appearance, others as voluptuous and exuberant women whose bodies convey overwhelming sensuality. There are those who resemble ordinary human women with soft and delicate features, yet who hide behind their appearance a supernatural essence. Conversely, others possess wings, bird legs, or fully hybrid bodies, a fusion of woman and bird, as in the most ancient traditions. The diversity of forms reflects a deeper truth. Sirens are not merely mythological creatures, but archetypes, symbolic representations of spiritual and moral forces in conflict. The skin tone of these entities ranges from translucent pale to golden bronze. Their eyes, often described as being of unusual colors, amber, violet, silver, suggest a gaze not belonging to the physical world, but one that pierces the soul. In some esoteric and occult traditions, there is mention of a hierarchy among sirens, organized into groups known as choirs. These sisterhoods are composed of several sirens who are born and raised together, remaining united throughout their existence. The eldest sister, possessing the most powerful and captivating voice, generally becomes the natural leader of the group. Once a choir is formed, they never accept new members, nor are they required to join new groups should their own be dissolved. However, when a siren finds herself separated from her sisters, whether due to the death of choir members, an unpermitted pregnancy, exile, or her own impending death, tradition holds that she chooses isolation. She withdraws to a solitary island or distant rock, where she lives in seclusion, singing to the waves, carrying within herself the echo of a lost sisterhood. This behavior mirrors the fate of the wives of the fallen angels, cast away from their people, marked by an irreversible transformation, dwelling at the fringes of the known world. Interestingly, early Christian and medieval writers used the image of sirens as a symbolic device to portray the seduction of sin. Saint Jerome, translator of the Bible into Latin in the famous Vulgate version, used the term sirens when translating the Hebrew word tanim, which most likely referred to jackals, in 495 passages such as Isaiah 13:22 and Jeremiah 50:39. His intention was not to legitimize Greek mythology, but to reinterpret these beings as allegories of vanity, lust, and spiritual corruption. In the 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria, a prominent theologian of the early church, described the siren as a symbolic figure of the courtesan, a woman who captivates with her voice and beauty, but leads men to perdition. In the 4th century, St. Ambrose reinforced this view by declaring that sirens represented worldly temptations, those which draw man away from holiness and immerse him in the waters of sin. These theological interpretations culminated in the teachings of Isidore of Seville, 560 to 636 AD, one of the greatest encyclopedists of the Middle Ages, whose writings solidified the view of sirens as moral symbols. According to him, the myth of the sirens was not to be used to promote paganism, but rather as a catechetical tool to warn Christians against the dangers of disordered passions. According to classical Greek tradition, there were 3 main sirens, each gifted with a particular art. One sang, another played the flute, and the third, the lyre. They awaited sailors near their island and, with their celestial melodies, lured men to shipwreck. They were often associated with prostitutes and libertine women who led men to economic and moral ruin. Hence, their songs were viewed as instruments of destruction. They bore wings and claws, symbols of love that flies and wounds. They remained connected to the sea because, according to mythology, They were born from the waves that gave rise to the goddess Venus. This association between sirens and carnal pleasure was not seen merely as a mythological fantasy, but as a spiritual warning. In the texts of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Isaiah 13:21-22 and 34:14 link these beings to desolate places in the company of other fantastic creatures such as the centaur Onos. Both are subjects of reflection in the Physiologus, one of the most influential texts of Christian moral literature, which described natural creatures through a symbolic and theological lens. Throughout the Middle Ages, sirens continued to be depicted as birds in Latin versions of the Physiologus from the 6th century up to at least the 13th. However, during this period, something began to shift. The first visual representations of sirens with fishtails appeared, possibly due to the influence of maritime cultures or a fusion between the symbolism of water and lust. In the Bern version of the Physiologus circa 9th century, the siren is already shown as a fishwoman, even though the accompanying text still describes her as a bird. In 13th century English bestiaries, illustrations depict sirens swimming in the sea with scaly tails, even as the texts continue to claim they have wings and bird feet. This is the fusion of two worlds, aerial and aquatic, spiritual and sensual. In later medieval iconography, especially in the bestiaries of the so-called Second Family, the siren came to be depicted with a double tail, holding a mirror and a comb, symbols that to this day define her image. The comb and mirror emerged as icons of vanity and self-worship, reflections of a soul so enchanted with itself that it turns away from its creator. There are also alternative records that preserve the older form. Manuscripts such as Harley 3244 depict sirens with wings emerging from their shoulders or hips, and in some hybrid versions, they retain the feet of birds. These complex representations reinforce the idea that sirens are distorted reflections of something that was once sacred, perhaps even the first women who touched the heavens with their hands but fell by embracing disobedience. In light of all this, one question echoes, deep and provocative. Are these creatures, described in myths, ancient manuscripts, and religious traditions, merely symbolic constructions? Or is there some spiritual truth hidden behind their images? The Book of Enoch, an apocryphal text held in high regard by many ancient religious traditions, suggests that the wives of the fallen angels, those who learned the forbidden heavenly secrets from the Watchers, were cursed with a spiritual and bodily metamorphosis. Could these be the very same beings who later came to be known as sirens, hybrid creatures, lost between two worlds, endowed with overwhelming beauty, but destined for isolation and ruin? Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever read the Book of Enoch? Do you believe that sirens could actually be the ancient wives of the fallen angels? Or do you see all of this as nothing more than age-old myths and allegories? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. May God bless you and see you soon.